And with that introduction, they'll just make the presentation. Is that okay? So we'll start on the end.
I'm Ruth Anderson, and like most American men, can you hear me? I was circumcised by American doctors at their behest. They thought it was a great thing to do, and many of them still feel that way. And I learned to live with it until about 20 years ago, when I happened to watch part of the Phil Donahue show on television. Remember Phil Donahue? He had a panel discussion on circumcision. Marilyn Milos and Richard Steiner and a few others. And Richard Steiner was from Phoenix. And he is the first man in the country to have a surgical foreskin restoration. And that intrigued me because I'd never questioned the possibility of foreskin restoration. But at the same time, I discovered in an ad in a newspaper here in Phoenix, another man who had surgical restoration, and he was advertising non-surgical restoration. So I wrote to him, and a year or so later I started my own restoration support group. We've been meeting now for 18 years. And shortly thereafter, I also started going out to the public to try to educate them on the benefits of leaving their children intact. One of the first things I did was set up a table at Margaret Hans Park in Phoenix with a great big sign saying circumcision is child abuse. And early in the morning, 3 ladies saw the sign, and they came to me from 300 feet away and said, "How can you justify your statement when circumcision is in the Bible?" And I didn't have a ready answer, but I do now. I've done a lot of research, and I've determined that there is no such thing as religious circumcision. It's a misunderstanding of the nature of religion and a misunderstanding of the nature of circumcision. I've also been aware that many women will say it's unfair to lump male circumcision in with female genital mutilation. The two things are completely different. Well, there are degrees of everything, and a year or so ago, the American Pediatric Association recommended that females from foreign countries just be given a pinprick instead of the radical circumcision that many of their cultures perform. And I'm here to say that there is no such thing as a difference between genital mutilation. There are different degrees of it, but everything is genital mutilation. There is no difference between male and female circumcision in that regard. Today in Arizona, the state of Arizona no longer funds circumcision through Medicaid. And the rate of circumcision in Arizona has gone from a high of maybe 90% a few years ago to 20% today. That's not true all over the country. And we're still working on getting other states to defund circumcision. Unfortunately, the US government is funding circumcision in Africa today. Last year, 2012, your tax dollars funded the circumcision of 20 million African men and boys. We are funding circumcision in Africa at the rate of 5 million every year for the next 13 years, and by 2025, some 80 million African men will have been circumcised with your tax money. The ostensible reason for this is to stop the spread of AIDS. But if anybody knows anything about AIDS in Africa, it is not fault of the foreskin, but of male rape of women. which is endemic all over Africa. We had our keynote speaker here yesterday, Mercy Musoni, talk about how she was nearly raped when she was a girl. And in South Africa today, about 3,000 girls and women are raped every day. And that is what is causing the spread of AIDS in Africa. It has nothing to do with foreskin, but the people who are opposed to the spread of AIDS don't know where else to turn. They can't convince the African men to stop raping women. It's part of their culture. And it's really unfair that we in Arizona have stopped funding genital mutilation of boys and send our tax dollars to Africa for circumcised people there. About 20 years ago, some of the doctors around the country started doing research into the intact penis. No one had ever researched the subject before. Today, we know that the inner foreskin of a male is the most sensitive erogenous tissue in the human body. And when that is excised, the male can no longer experience a normal sexual experience. But importantly, neither can his wife or females. It's absolutely necessary that both male and female be intact to have a normal sexual experience. And when you excise any sensuous material from a body, you completely change the situation for the couple. So we are both interested in restoring the foreskin and in stopping the spread of circumcision around the country and the world. The United States today is the only country in the world that still circumcises for no good reason. And at one time, over 1 million boys in this country were circumcised every year. That has gone down now to about 700,000. Today, as we sit here, boys are being circumcised here in Phoenix. And the only way they can object is by screaming in pain and going into shock. It's a terrible situation. Yesterday we talked a great deal about female circumcision in Africa and the
Just about 1 more minute, half a minute.
yeah. I've lost my point.
Female circumcision.
Africa.
Anyway, circumcision in Africa is one thing, but we really need to get to a point in this country where we understand what we're doing to children when we circumcise them. This is a book about a boy who was circumcised. He and his twin brother were circumcised. Unfortunately, this boy had his entire penis burned off. So his parents, at the behest of Dr. Money in Baltimore, had his testicles removed also, and they raised him as a girl. This is an extreme example of what had happened, but it's just one example of what happens to children. About 100 boys die every year in this country because of circumcision. It's kept quiet, and they usually attribute it to blood loss or something like that, but it really is because of circumcision. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ed Hines, and I'm here representing No More Deaths. And we're an all-volunteer humanitarian aid organization. We were formed in 2004 by some former members of the 1980s sanctuary movement in response to increasing numbers of deaths on the U.S.-Mexico border. And for all those of you who don't know, the sanctuary movement was movement in faith community in the 1980s to help protect refugees that were coming up from Central America, who the U.S. government was refusing to recognize as refugees because of their economic and political involvement in a lot of the regimes that were responsible for creating the situation in the first place. Basically, since the imposition of NAFTA in 1994 and the subsequent Operation Gatekeeper, which was basically a militarization of the border that hadn't existed before, thousands of men, women, and children have died crossing the border in the Sonora Desert, and this just wasn't happening before NAFTA. And also, NAFTA created a greater push for migration northwards because it displaced a lot of people from their lands, and they couldn't compete with North American, with United States corporations that were coming in, like agricultural corporations. So a lot of people were forced to move northward, and then the traditional routes, migration routes through the cities were made unavailable to them by greater U.S. military presence. So they're forced out to desert regions, and this is where a lot of deaths have increased. And also because of this, a lot of the cartels moved in and took over the smuggling industry because they're a lot better equipped to deal with law enforcement in a way that the traditional mom and pop smuggling organizations hadn't been before. So No More Deaths were guided by the principle that the militarized border enforcement strategy has been a failure. And, it's merely served to raise the attrition rate for the most vulnerable population involved in the whole process. So a coalition of groups has established practical means to aid migrants who are driven away from urban crossing centers. The coalition determined that an around-the-clock, non-violent, humanitarian physical presence in the desert would be most effective. And the goals of this coalition, which was No More Deaths, were to provide food and water and medical assistance to migrants walking through the Arizona desert, and to monitor U.S. government agencies and their agents on the border, and to work to change the U.S. border policy and resolve the crisis on the border, and to bring the situation faced by migrants to public attention. And this was done by recruiting different aid programs, establishing camps and migrant centers on the border for assistance, outreach to affected communities, border monitoring. And under the No More Deaths umbrella, participating groups are staffed by volunteers and abide by clear medical and legal protocols and work in concert to save human lives.
Hello, Yate. My name is Clayson Bernali. I am from the Sacred Peaks Coalition. Also, my clients traditionally we always introduce ourselves. This could take up the whole 5 minutes. Just so you know, Purichini Bashichin Aranakane, Dene Dashinella, Tifajin De Ayisimasha. And this is always how we introduce ourselves because we recognize first and foremost that we are all related, we are all brothers and sisters. And the struggles that are represented today, we know that human rights, sacred sites, living on this planet, if you have a heart, if you care about these issues, all you have to do is walk out your front door and pick one because we're faced with them daily. I want to just see, maybe by a show of hands, how many people are familiar with the San Francisco Peaks and the issue that we've had to protect it? That's good. Because otherwise I could use up the whole 5 minutes explaining the history, which has been very complex going back, from obviously when the Spanish had first encountered this mountain and they looked at it from the Hopi Mesas and they recognized that this particular mountain, which is named after St. Francis of Assisi, patron saint of ecology, that this mountain is an oasis in the desert. It's a sacred site, for 22 tribes, and it's basically how the Bible, the first man, first woman. This is the point of origin for many tribes. This is home to critical habitat. There's so much about these mountains, and even the federal government, through this whole process, they recognize that this is a sacred site, and it's started a huge dialogue on sacred sites throughout America. But to kind of run through the history very quickly, 1979, there was a case that went pretty much all the way to the Supreme Court, where they tested the Religious Freedom Act for indigenous people and determined that Native people don't have religious freedom. Americans who have, this is what America is founded on, is, your forefounders fleeing persecution, seeking freedom of religion. But for indigenous people, it's not necessarily something that were granted or afforded. And that was tested in 1978, where they basically said you can go pray on the other side of the mountain. So, as we kind of fast forward through time, in 2000, that basically enabled this ski resort to build within a 7,700 acre parameter. And they didn't do a full build out at that point. And then in 2000, they decided, okay, we wanted to do a full build out. With the help of the Forest Service, with basically taxpayer dollars, they came up with this plan to use reclaimed wastewater to make snow. And unfortunately, after nearly a decade of being in the courts, the Navajo Nation, 7 tribes, 3 environmental groups, the case was based on something called RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And this was basically, they were trying to determine whether there would be a burden placed on religion, on somebody's practice. So indigenous cultures, that went to go pray, are they going to be denying access? These were things that they were looking at. And unfortunately, they basically came to the conclusion that there's going to be no burden placed on religion, even though this is complete desecration. And through the Forest Service's environmental impact statement, they acknowledge that this will be extreme desecration, this to the sacred site. So, as we fast forward through time, my family was a litigant in a case that was brought to, I guess, on the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act, which basically we were asking, well, what's in the snow? What's going to happen to a child if they ingest this snow? So this is something that was brought in the previous case but was dismissed. And a lot of technicalities, over the process of these court cases, you definitely start to see a biasness. How if you get a judge that's Republican or, party lines is usually how they'll rule on environmental issues. And through all these cases, that's kind of been the determining factor of how they rule. And for my situation, essentially they ruled against us in the district court here in Phoenix, and a lot of people came out and supported. Extremely grateful. And going through the Ninth Circuit Court, where they basically, it was something that would have been precedent-setting because they imposed sanctions. We had 3 Republican judges rule against us, and they were going to rule and place sanctions on our attorney, Howard Schenker. And it was about to create a precedence that would have, I guess, any lawyer that would have brought a case pro bono and got up against the corporations or any governmental agencies could be liable for the damages, and it would have threatened any organization out there that would have tried to challenge the system, essentially. So today, they are using reclaimed wastewater. The snow did come out yellow when they put it up on the San Francisco peaks as of December 24th. And there's a lot of unanswered questions, like what happens if a child eats the snow? Thousands of people, mostly Phoenicians, that have been, advertised, and this product is kind of being sold to, skiing, such a lovely idea for people here in the desert. this particular snow, we know that it has what they call endocrine disruptors, personal care products, and it has the ability to feminize fish. Aquatic species such as amphibians, it completely alters their endocrine system, and there's a public alarm. This is something that is nationwide. We need to be looking at what is in these reclaimed wastewater treatment plants. The water that they use up at Snowball, Arizona Snowball, is what they consider grade A plus reclaimed wastewater, which currently the Arizona Department of AQ, why am I forgetting the last, it stands for Air and Water Quality, they say that it's okay to use this particular snow, but you cannot immerse yourself in. And the challenge is that skiing is basically full immersion, especially if you face plant, or if somebody is ingesting it, or if it gets under skin, which is one of our largest organs, an external organ. So we know that there are human impacts. Scientists and communities at large have been studying this and know that there is an impact to wildlife, and that it suggests that there is going to be an impact to humans, especially if a pregnant mother is exposed to this material. And this is something that, as a community, there should be alarm. We should be looking at, okay, what is in this water? It's going to be recharging our aquifers. This is something that we're going to be ingesting, not only in Flagstaff, but nationwide, and the policies that the EPA sets. So unfortunately, we have lost our case. A lot to fit into these minutes, huh? There are other cases that have been brought by the Hopi tribe, and that particular case they withdrew to allow for testing from the Department of Wild, Game and Fish Department. Every time they turn on the guns for the snowmaking, they have to monitor the wind, because there is a very unique flower, the San Franciscus groundsel flower, which only exists on this mountain. It is an extremely endangered species, and the Hopis were the first people to ask, well, what is going to be the impacts? People have posted this earlier, but they actually did an analysis of what happens when the wind blows, where does the snow go, and asked that question and brought that to the courts, where they lost, of course, in the district court in Flagstaff, and they appealed and kind of signed some sort of the deal that they've entered into right now is that they're withdrawing their litigation temporarily until until all of the research and if there is going to be any impact. So we know that that is one little small sliver of hope, but through the whole process there has been direct action, civil disobedience, people have locked down, there have been tree sits, and it's been critical. Just a few weeks ago there was Idle No More. How many of you are familiar with Idle No More? Alright, we're going to have to write this up on the bulletin board, because all of you should know about Idle No More. And that's a larger indigenous movement that's growing. And it's connected to the sacred sites, to the human health impacts. But a young child, two Navajo boys had their hand drums ripped from their hands at a dune downtown, I guess, protest that was brought directly connected with Idle No More, where they're doing a round dance and trying to educate the public. And a 31-year-old woman came through swinging, ripped banners out, and physically harmed one of these this young Navajo boy. So we know that things are critical, and the mindset, of people, public health, all of these things that we're struggling to protect, the sacred places, it's disheartening, because this is where we need support, this is where we need help, is educating the public, letting them know that these struggles that we're fighting for, it's not just for our behalf, it's for our children and for their children's children, and for the greater interest of public health. Lots of good news.
Kim, and I'm a culture and anthropology graduate student at ASU, and I'm from South Korea. And although I have lots of things to talk about North Korea and South Korea and all about these things, today I want to talk about my friends in Kenya, in Africa, and especially about Mama Mugo, who is in the heaven right now, but started this great movement for the local children and youth in Nyeri, municipal town in Kenya. So do you know where Kenya is first? Yeah.
It's on the eastern coast.
Yes, it's in the eastern coast. Here, over there, that's the horn of East Africa. You see Somalia is right on the horn, and Kenya is, sharing a border right near Ethiopia, Somalia, and Tanzania. Yeah, that's Kenya. And then, can you think of any image about Kenya? What's your popular image?
Jomo Kenyatta.
Yeah, Jomo Kenyatta. Yeah, that's
Wow.
amazing. That's very hard, actually. That's difficult information that you do, but thank you. Yeah, that's the first president of Kenya. And usually people think of Kenya as like, safari tour, all these animals and Maasai people, I guess. That's kind of popular image, right? And then, but what I'm trying to show today is actually nothing about animals, nothing about Maasai people, but about these people in Nyeri, a municipal town at the middle of Central Province in Kenya. Central Province is one, something like state in here, Arizona state. And then in Nyeri, there is this Shauriyako Community Children Youth Support Center, which was founded by Mama Mugo. And Shauriyako means actually your problem. But it sounds a little bit awkward, but actually conventional meaning is you are independent and you are on your own. So this center is helping children and youth who want to be independent and out of this. Actually, this is in the middle of a slum community in Nyeri. And then if you want to go outside this slum area and if you want to get educated, you should be independent, something like that. So that's the motto of Shauriyako Community Children's Center. And then why I know about this community is because first year at ASU, graduate student, don't know what to do, and then what should I do, what am I studying here? And I was kind of lost, in the middle of this foreign country. And then I just felt like maybe I can just make my dream come true first, and then think about my research. And then my dream at the time was going to somewhere in Africa. And then I was just Googling and Googling and Googling, and then where can I just volunteer and whom I can just contact. And then I found this person, Joseph Mwai, who's Kenyan-Canadian, but from this slum community, and now is a great person who's helping his own hometown and the people in Sudan. And then I just exchanged a lot of email, and then he just invited me. And then although I had to pay my flight fee and everything, but he invited me, and then I met him there. And then next I met Mama Mugo. Although she was already she was in the heaven at the time of the moment, but I just felt like, when I saw this photo and when I saw her history here in the center, I just felt like, I'm meeting her now here. Yeah. And then Mama Mugo, she was, a single mother after independence from British colonialism, and she lost her husband from the struggle. It's Mau Mau movement in the history of Kenya, fighting against British colonial guys. And then her husband died in that struggle, and then she was alone with 5 children, 4 sons and 1 daughter. And then this is her, own, part about that time. Like during those times, life was very hard. Many families in the communities were run by single mothers, or single mothers, still single mothers, and nothing to do and little job. And then you see Asian business homes. Those means the Indian people's business. They are a little bit well off, relatively. And then they have this business and homes, and they hire lots of domestic workers and other workers from like Kenyan population. And then the garbage bins, and then she had hope, although it was desperate. It was really, really hard, but she had hope. And then this is the house, right in the middle of the slum. This was actually Mama Mugo's house when she was alive. And then although she had 5 children, she opened her house door. And then all the children in the community just dropped by and then, Mama Mugo, can I have some food? And then she always gave anything she had in her kitchen. And this is still there. And then this is our, although I know it doesn't look nice, but this is our center of Shaoriako. And then this is right in front of Shaoriako Center. It was a dumping site at the time, and it is still dumping site. And then you see the child over there. This is her everyday ecology. You know, I don't want to reproduce this poor image of African people, but this is reality that we have to see. Okay? It's dumping site, and they just burn, and they just becomes accumulating, and it's like every day. And that's her playground, actually. Yeah. And then in the center, what we used to do, we stopped this service because we were, you know, the funding ran out. The feeding service for the local children, they just drop by and get some food. That actually, I forgot the food name. I saw Beth here, but sorry, yeah, I forgot the food name. But this is Mary, and this is her younger sibling, Eunice. And the mother has 6 children, and the youngest on her chest, and the fathers are all different. I feel terrible that I have to say this, but fathers are different, and then they don't know where their fathers are, and they just survive. And the mother doesn't have any house, and she has 6 children, and then similar things are all around this community. But when we were doing very well, like in my handout, maybe some of you have read, we had another office area in the downtown open area, and we had this vocational training, and then in this computer center, although I know the computers do not look nice, but at least they could learn some basic computer skills. And then we also had this tailoring classes for young women, single mothers. And then that was the beginning day of some group of young women here. That's me, and then my friends and teacher, it's kind of their teacher, and office worker Eunice, and that's Baba Siku. Siku's father, but his name is Anthony Mushero, and he is the youngest son of Mama Mugo. So he is now, you know, succeeding his mother's legacy here. And then these young women, next, young women, these people, you know, next, and then next, yeah, they all, you know, had the tailoring classes, and they graduated in the end. And then this is computer teacher Agnes, and then tailoring teacher and Eunice, office worker, and then Degwa, he does just everything. And the next, please. Okay. And then it's with me, yeah. Oh, it's okay. Just yeah. And then, unfortunately, so these things were happening until like last year, not last, 2 years ago actually. And then I made 3 visits. And then first time and second time we were doing very well, but third time I went back there, everything was gone because we didn't have enough funding anymore. And then in the recent email from Jose Muai, the person that I contacted for the first time, he said, you know, since there is no funding to support staff, we have let most of them go, and the only Degwa is now here. And then, and this is Degwa, and that's the center right now. And what we are trying to do now is, you know, building a wall around this, because there are, you know, it's very sad, but there are so many thieves and robbery issues. To protect at least the building itself, we need to just, you know, build some walls and then, you know, some kind of fences. And that's what we are trying to do right now, although we kind of stopped all the feeding program, the vocational skills program, things like that. So I'm not asking you to donate or something like that, but I just want you to know that there are, of course, there are like UNICEF, Red Cross, Save the Children, and blah, 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 a lot of, you know, international, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, like Mama Mugo, you know, there are people who try to do by themselves from like a grassroots level, from locally, and then community-based movement and activism. Those things are going on in Kenya and I think all over Africa too. It's difficult to recognize from here, right? But that's happening, and I just wanted to introduce my friends' struggles / efforts, like everyday efforts. Yeah, that was all. Yeah. Thank you. But if you are interested in, just let me know, and then I have my name card over there, and yeah. Thank you for listening.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Amar Daniels. I am representing BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, where we're continuously striving for racial equity, immigration rights, and economic justice. In a real sense, I guess you could say BAJI is an extension of what began in the 1850s, to say the least, when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, and it became possible for Africans who had escaped enslavement to be returned, even though they may be currently residing in a free state. It was at that time that Frederick Douglass went to Europe for a while, and he began to advocate strongly for abolitionists, and that became a very important part. We could fast forward from that period of time to the 1900s, when W.E.B. Du Bois formed the first Pan-African Congress in Paris in 1919. He represented African Americans who were struggling against political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation, whereas the Africans who attended that conference was fighting against the colonial powers that existed, colonial powers whose hands were stretched throughout Africa, and in a real sense, the residual effects can be seen in the presentation that preceded me with the vast amounts of poverty that exists throughout the continent of Africa nowadays. When we talk about human rights, we would be remiss, particularly as an African American or as a human being, not to take a look at the laudable efforts of Malcolm X. Malcolm was clear in his mind to draw a distinction between civil rights, which is what was being advocated by Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights struggle during that time, and human rights. Malcolm knew quite well that civil rights existed in the hands of those who were oppressing you at that time, but human rights involved the entire world. So it was in 1963, early 64, that he took the plight of African Americans to the United Nations for having violated the human rights of black people. BAJI understands this, and it understands this in the relationships we form, not only with our Chicano brothers and sisters over here who are coming from Mexico, Central and South America, but also with many Africans who are coming from the continent, of course, of Africa. That's an important part. It was W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, who said, "The battlefront is everywhere. There is no sheltered rear." When we talk of civil rights, when we talk of human rights, it's important that we understand ourselves first, that we begin with the person in the mirror. Racism, white supremacy, and white privilege is such an integral part of what America is all about. When we have our discussions, we just don't assume because we're black, we're going to all think alike. We just don't assume because we form coalitions with brown people that we're going to think alike. That's like expecting a box of crayons to draw because they all have color. It's impossible. There must be the discussions that are heartfelt. There must be discussions that are genuine. There must be the kind of discussions that allow us to break through the barriers of political correctness and all the stereotypes that exist. And I want to comment on my brother on the far end who said that rape is an important part of African culture. Is that what's happening in India also, where that young girl was raped and killed a few months ago? No, this is aberrant behavior. There's no cultural dictates throughout the continent of Africa that excuses that kind of behavior, although it does exist. It exists over here, but there's no cultural kinds of things that people espouse in the continent of Africa there. It's been said that once you change your philosophy, you change your thought pattern. Once you change your thought pattern, it changes your attitude. And once you change your attitude, it changes your behavior pattern. To the extent that our philosophies are about thinking globally, but acting locally, and in some cases acting globally, it's to the extent that we become better aware of who we are, that person in the mirror really is. It starts with us. Once we get our act together, once our philosophies are clear, then we can extend that hand around the world. But until we take a look at ourselves, the biases, the chauvinism, the homophobia, and all the other kind of isms we can ill afford to project around the world. And that's a crucial thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do because we much rather charge in on the white charger with the benevolent father hoping to free the world. It starts with us. It starts with the next door neighbor. It starts with the organizations right down the block. But I do applaud, and on behalf of Baji, I applaud all of you who are here because you are doing something. It's good to see the young generation picking up the baton that started so many centuries ago, but certainly picking up that baton in a way and running it in the way that you can best identify with. Not what your elders are saying, not what we think is okay or not okay, but you're following the dictates of your heart. And I would like to think, by following the dictates of your heart, you cannot do anything but what is correct. There's a lot to do. There's plenty of room at the table for all of us, and I applaud all of you there, and I applaud all of us here for the work that we are doing so handsomely, because there was a great need for that, and so much more. Thank you on behalf of Baji.
I'm going to not use the microphone. I'm assuming people in the back can hear me. Let me know if you can. My name is Chris Landry. I'm from the East Timor Action Network. I have a successful story for you today. We're an NGO that was formed in the United States in 1992 in reaction to Indonesia's occupation of East Timor, which began in 1975 and ended in the deaths of about 1/3 of the population due to Indonesia's genocidal policies. And we formed our organization in support of self-determination for East Timor. So again, we weren't asking for independence. What we were arguing is that the East Timorese had the right to determine their own future, which was not granted to them. And so we wanted them to have that right. And to sort of get to the end of the story, before I tell you the middle part, East Timor voted for independence on August 30th, 1999, separating itself from Indonesia, one of the few cases of national separatism to actually meet with success in the 20th century in the post-World War II decolonization period. I was working there with the United Nations as an observer, and if there's time later, I can tell you about that if you have any questions. So, next slide, please. I'm going to breeze over this stuff because maybe you don't care, but we also don't have time. If we think about how NGOs work politically, there's a lot of theorizing about this that goes back to the 1960s. For example, Robert Dahl and Paul Yarki, essentially arguing that small, very motivated groups can actually persuade an ambivalent majority and have a success in terms of getting a response from a democratically elected government. Catherine Sekink and Margaret Keck have written about how NGOs work, especially globally organized NGOs or internationally organized NGOs, by lobbying home governments to then put pressure on a foreign government to change its policies. ETAN did this very effectively, and we lobbied the United States government and got a lot of pressure put on Indonesia to change its policies in East Timor. We got a small arms ban enacted, a military training ban enacted, blocked the sales of F-16s, etc. Next slide, please. So what is East Timor? I'm going to breeze over this as well since we've only got a couple of minutes, but as I said, invaded in 1975 by Indonesia, resulting in the deaths of about 1 out of every 3 people in 5 years due to famine and actual conflict. Prior to that, it was a Portuguese colony. The United States had its hands dirty in the invasion of East Timor. Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger were in Jakarta the day before the invasion and essentially gave the dictator Suharto the green light to invade. We know this through declassified documents. And the United States, Henry Kissinger went against congressional intent to continue to sell arms to Indonesia, even though they had just invaded this peaceful emerging democracy in Southeast Asia. Fast forward to 1991. So years of the occupation had taken the toll on the East Timorese, and there was a massacre at the Santa Cruz Cemetery where peacefully demonstrating East Timorese were gunned down by Indonesian soldiers using American-made M16s and other arms. The difference about this massacre than what had happened in East Timor prior is that it was filmed by Alan Nairn and Amy Goodman. Any names ring a bell? Amy Goodman dropped down. Okay, fine. So this video footage was smuggled out by a Dutch woman named Saskia. Her story is amazing. I can tell you about it if we have more time. Broadcast around the world, first in Holland, then in the United States on 60 Minutes. So here was incontrovertible evidence that Indonesians were using American-made arms to slaughter East Timorese, right? So as an American, I felt I had a duty to lobby my government to stop this, right? It's wrong. And it also let the world know what was really going on in East Timor. It had been closed by the Indonesians, people weren't allowed to go there, including reporters, et cetera. So it was very difficult to get current news out of East Timor. Next slide, please. Oh, back, please. So ETAN was founded as a reaction to this massacre in 1992. Within 5 years, we had 25 chapters nationally. I founded or co-founded the Arizona chapter after moving here in 1997 to go to grad school. I was a member in Seattle beginning in 1993. We lobbied, identified key allies in Congress, in districts, especially Democratic districts, that would put pressure in Congress to do things like ban small arms sales and military training. We demonstrated in Arizona. It was a little bit tougher than Seattle for reasons I'm sure you can probably understand. Some people looked at us as though we were crazy, but that being said, we did speaking tours. We brought East Timorese over, people who were lawyers, people who were women's rights activists, etc. We targeted audiences. We did several talks here. In fact, a friend of mine, Constancio Pinto, slept on my couch once in Seattle, twice here. He is now, he just resigned as or was just reassigned from being the ambassador of East Timor to the United States. He's now the deputy foreign minister. It's a small country, so people get around. But he was sleeping on people's couches in the 90s, going around talking about what was going on in East Timor. And again, we had target issues that I've already mentioned. Next slide, please. So in 1998, when I first got here, we had a demonstration. This is just a brief aside. Henry Kissinger, the man who was partly responsible for giving the green light to Suharto to invade East Timor, giving American permission, was here, and we decided to demonstrate. He was inaugurating a chair in the Honors College in the spring of 1998, which is kind of crazy. I consider Kissinger a war criminal. I'm sure there are probably some people who are sympathetic to that perspective as well. But what we decided to do was an action where we created a fake pamphlet welcoming Dr. Henry Kissinger. And there were activists, other activists from other groups who were carrying signs, etc. They were all kicked off. We wore suits and passed out a pamphlet. And if you open it, on the inside, you can see the one in the background, Kissinger in East Timor, Kissinger in Latin America, foreign policy for hire, etc. Went in and sat down in the second row, first row was ripped off. Lo and behold, Henry the Case sits in front of me, and I ask him to autograph the pamphlet. So that's Henry Kissinger. Pamphlet. So as soon as he kicks the bucket, it's going on eBay. And then we got some press, right? And this was the goal. We wanted press, right? I asked the first question, I ran to the microphone, and said, tell me about East Timor. We can talk about that interaction later or at another time or whatever. But essentially, the crowd was booing me because I was talking about East Timor democracy, and then I would make a point, and there was maybe 10% of the people would like me. So anyway, got press. That was one of the key goals of ETAN, right? We need to get information about our struggle because a lot of people didn't know about East Timor. Next slide, please. So we had targeted alliances. We thought strategically, right? Because East Timor is predominantly Catholic organizations worked with us in solidarity, right? We didn't, our organization wasn't Catholic oriented, and we don't necessarily believe everything the Catholic Church does, but it was a useful alliance. People used to portray the conflict in East Timor as a religious conflict, and there were religious elements to it, but it wasn't the cause. But at the same time, it helped us get allies in Congress and elsewhere. Indonesia specialist. So I'm an Indonesia specialist myself. I teach here at ASU, but I'm also an activist. But we got other academics to come out and write about it. Noam Chomsky, Jeffrey Winters, all sorts of other people, and that was great in building support for our cause. Other organizations, Amnesty International, etc., international law scholars, because we argued that the invasion of East Timor was a breach of international law, which it was, clearly. But of course, we needed Indonesians and East Timorese who were sympathetic to us. So we created a broad network in Indonesia and East Timor itself. We smuggled out information about killings and disappearances, etc. That was key. And I was going to mention some opposition to ETAN. We had corporations, including, for example, the weapons industry in the United States weren't happy with us, and a very conservative U.S.-Indo organization that wanted to block our efforts to have East Timor have a referendum. Next slide, please. The window of opportunity arose in 1997, 1998 with the East Asian economic crisis. It wound up toppling Suharto. Nobody saw him stepping down as dictator, and we brought the pressure to bear on the U.S. government at this point to insist on a referendum for East Timor. And Suharto's replacement, his Vice President B.J. Habibie, agreed. For some reason, we have no idea how he made his decision. We didn't care, but this window of opportunity allowed the referendum to take place on August 30th, 1999. Unfortunately, the Indonesians were in charge of security, and they implemented a scorched earth policy that destroyed about 80% of the infrastructure, created refugees, etc. And East Timor is still sort of struggling to come back from that. Next slide, please. But the referendum occurred, and they voted for their independence. 80% voted for independence. And as an observer, if there weren't Indonesian soldiers with machine guns around the voting booths, I think it probably would have been closer to 90 or 95%. Next slide, please. So what do we do after we achieved our goal? So I'm not arguing, by the way, that the East Timor Action Network is responsible for the independence of East Timor. Of course it's not. We are responsible, however, for pressuring the U.S. government to change its policy and put pressure to bear on the Indonesian government, right? And we worked in solidarity with groups in Canada, Ireland, Australia, Japan, Thailand, South Africa, etc., everywhere to build this pressure. And as I stated earlier, we saw it as sort of a personal responsibility as being a citizen of a country that's selling arms to Indonesia to stop that. And that really was how we portrayed our struggle. So people in ETAN now have founded an organization called Lahal Mutuk, which is Tetum for Walking Together. After 1999 in the referendum, a lot of people said, okay, great, the problem's over. As an NGO, we don't need you anymore. So we really contracted in terms of funding, etc. But a lot of our membership have gone on to do other things. The folks in Seattle are still very active in the peace movement there. And as I said, we continue to have a presence in East Timor, working with indigenous East Timorese to continue the struggle for human rights there and accountability. And also, by the way, we here at Phoenix now, the IWW is here. We've been protesting Freeport-McMoRan for their policies in West Papua. So the East Timor Action Network became the East Timor and Indonesia Action Network. If you don't know anything about what's going on in West Papua because of Freeport, hopefully we can talk you that. And I know I talked fast, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dan Peitzmeyer. I'm with Death Penalty Alternatives for Arizona. I was prepared to do about 4 minutes, so we could maybe open it up to questions of the board. I want to thank you, Aaron, and all of your team for putting this together. It's a wonderful event. It gives us an opportunity to express our causes, and I want to thank all of you for coming. This is an important time of year for those of us who are interested in the abolition of the death penalty. March 1st was International Death Penalty Abolition Day because it was on that date in 1847 that the state of Michigan became the first English-speaking territory to outlaw capital punishment. Amnesty International has bracketed March 1st with 2 weeks death penalty action weeks. And coincidentally, it started yesterday as local and global justice started, and it will conclude on March 10th. There are a lot of activities coming up during that time frame. First up, on the 27th of this month, there's a clemency hearing down in Florence for Edward Shadd, a man the state plans to execute on March 6th. If you have the free time to go to Florence and sit in on a clemency hearing, I would certainly recommend it. I've been to 7 of them over the last few years. It's just the most moving experience to have the convict there in a cage, shackled, as the clemency board or non-clemency board listens, demeans the inmate, demeans his attorneys, demeans the expert witnesses that come in. It's appalling. Anyhow, that's the 27th. On the 28th, down at Phoenix School of Law, Juan Melendez will speak at noon. He will also speak at 6 o'clock out at Glendale Community College. Juan Melendez spent 17 years, 10 months, and 2 days on death row in Florida for a crime he did not commit. He's a New Yorican. He's a feisty guy. I've had the pleasure of meeting him on several occasions. He really gives a testimony to what it's like to be unjustly convicted. On the 1st of March, Friday the 1st of March, International Death Penalty Abolition Day, there's an all-day seminar at the law school. Very powerful seminar. Juan will speak there again at the noon hour. Then on the 2nd, we in the Death Penalty Abolition, or Death Penalty Alternatives for Arizona, have our annual meeting, and that's also in the law school, room 105, Saturday morning. You're all welcome. It's open to everyone without charge. We have a phenomenal speaker, a local attorney who's highly regarded, Gary Stewart. I met with Gary. He's a 3-time nominee for the Arizona Supreme Court, but he's never appointed because he's an independent. So the Democratic governors don't appoint him and the Republican governors don't appoint him. But the fact that he is so well respected, he gets up before, gets on the short list. Gary is the author of 6 books, the most recent of which is Innocent Until Interrogated, which focuses on the assassination, the 9 murders at the Buddhist temple in 1991, just west of Phoenix, and how 5 people from Tucson who were not in the area confessed to the crime simply because of the interrogation efforts. It's also somewhat relevant if you look on the case of the West Memphis 3, where the 3 teenage boys were convicted of a crime, although there was no physical evidence linking them to that, simply because one of them did admit guilt. A couple of, I have flyers. I invite you to visit our table out here. The death penalty is wrong, in my opinion, for so many reasons, the first of which is it's racially biased.
Do the vigil and the protest.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. After our meeting on the 2nd, we will have a vigil at the state capitol on Tuesday, March 5th. And that's at 6 p.m. at the state capitol. There were 2 bills introduced to the legislature this year. Senate Bill 1048, introduced by Senator Ed Ablisser, who's a graduate from here, and another bill, Senate Bill 1338, introduced by Senator Dave Bradley. Ablisser's bill called for a repeal of the death penalty. Bradley's bill called for a moratorium on the death penalty. Both bills died in committee. They weren't heard. So we'll have that vigil on the 2nd. There will be a protest on the 6th. I think probably Mr. Shad will be executed on the 6th. We'll be down in Florence to protest his execution. I want it understood that none of us excuse the abhorrent behavior of the convicts. Very few of the people I know are innocent. I mean, Juan was innocent and condemned. Here in Arizona, there have been 8 exonerees. The most well-known is Ray Crone, who speaks frequently in the area. But the majority of the guys I know on death row are guilty. And they go before the clemency board, not because they're innocent, but because they are seeking clemency. You know, when I seek to abolish the death penalty, I don't do so based on the hideous crimes that these men have committed, but rather, what does it say about us as a society? My proposal is that it's bad public policy. You know, how do you convince people that killing people is wrong by killing them? It just doesn't make any more sense to me than a parent swatting a child saying, "I told you not to hit your brother." You know, it just doesn't make sense. So the 3 big factors are racial. It is terribly biased. If a white person is murdered, the person who committed that murder is likely to be executed. If a person of color is murdered, it's like, who cares? That's another thing that's very difficult is the way it's set up presently. Individuals, last year 6 people were executed in Arizona. I don't know how many people pay attention to that we executed 6 men. Of the 6 men that were executed, 3 of them had accomplices or co-defendants or perpetrators. We don't really know which of the 2 was more culpable. But the smarter one went to the police first and flipped on the other one. So that one man is executed, the other man is free in society. So race is an issue, cost is an issue. It's far more costly to execute people than it is to give them life in prison. And that's simply, a lot of that is due to the judicial aspects of it. When one is seeking, average death penalty trial might go 9.5 days. If you're seeking capital punishment, it's going to go 37 or 40 days, just from the get-go. Instead of having one defender, they're going to have 2. Then there's all the, Kevin? What?
Two-tiered jury parts. You have the jury for guilt, the jury for sentencing, so it's a 2-tiered phase of the sentence. Then you have a mandatory direct appeal to the Supreme Court, post-conviction review, and then they get a crack at habeas. And so you're looking at an extended appellate process, which is important, but the way the system's designed is to affirm the verdict of guilt and death, and it's not really a fair process.
Thank you. And the cost of all this, most attorneys, not attorneys that are defending these people, but most law enforcement officials would rather have the money that's spent on prosecution to spend on other resources. They could hire more police. They could open more cold cases. They could solve more crimes. And the last factor that I want to address is that of innocence. Since 1976, over 1,300 people have been executed. In that same time frame, 141 people have been exonerated. So if you do the math on that, we have somewhere around 10%, 9%, 9.4% of the people who could have been executed in that time frame have been free. And I know that if I had a chance of landing safely about 10% of the time, or 90% of the time I flew, if I had a 10% chance of getting it wrong, I wouldn't do it. And that's the quote that I would like to close with, if I can find it here. It's from Judge Boyce Martin. Now, Boyce was on the Court of Appeals, the Sixth Circuit, he says, "I've been a judge on this court for more than 25 years. After all these years, however, only one conclusion is possible. The death penalty in this country is arbitrary, biased, and so fundamentally flawed at its very core that it is beyond repair." I invite you to stop by at our table. Kevin will be there, I'll be there, Brett will be there. Thank you.
Okay, so we have theoretically 5 minutes, but we can move lunch. We're the biggest group. If we go a few minutes late to lunch, it's not going to be long because we're the main group. So if anyone wants to ask questions, it'd be great.
We'll start, with Kevin. So during the course of the time I've worked with various social movements across the spectrum, from working with sacred site protections and death penalty work, or even health issues like having access to clean needles if you're addicted to drugs, there's something I've considered in the sense that we tend to, as activists, to try to protest and engage in power struggles with the government and other moneyed interests that have opposite views that we have. And I'm wondering to the extent that you've thought about these power struggles and how effective are they? And is there alternative methods that we should also be considering? Maybe something like an institutional entrepreneurship, sort of like a Gramscian neo-Marxist idea of finding ways to take over the government and instituting new values and going away from the values that the state is designed to perpetuate oppression and pursue the interests of maybe money and state, the landed interests. So have you thought about ways in which your organizations and things that you're working for The extent to which power struggles have either been beneficial and actually, engaged in solidarity and affinity and consciousness building, or versus the idea of, finding ways to get inside the system so you can just throw a spear into the wheels and really stop it. Have you thought about that paradigm at all?
Well, let's keep the responses quick because there were some other hands.
I certainly think you raised excellent points there, but I believe through the power struggles that you mentioned, they are means of educating the people. They expose the contradictions. People oftentimes have to look at something and see what's taking place, and it may very well prick their consciousness. It may serve as a springboard to looking deeper into what's going on. Without those powers, and I look at the civil rights movement, there was an attempt time after time to petition the U.S. government to step in and do away with some of the politics of the state. Had it not been for those contradictions, had it not been for the cases that attorneys like Charles Houston, there never could have been a Brown versus Board of Education of 1954. So it was Charles Houston and his exposing some of the contradictions, the disparities in the pay that black teachers were receiving versus white teachers, and a whole host of challenges that made people take note. And it also resulted in 9 Supreme Court justices in 1954 ruling against 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case.
You're good if you're loud. If you want to grab a mic.
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, it's interesting, right? The notion of protest and what makes a successful protest, right? I would argue a counterpoint, and that is that in systems that are theoretically responsive to their citizens, democracies, that it's possible to change. And I think looking at change over a long-term perspective is actually a pretty safe way to go. Civil rights, for example, is a good example. If you compare the situation now to obviously 150 years ago, not perfect, but getting there, and I think it's possible to get to the right place. We had a really small window to work with and found success in 7 years. Although, like I said, the Eastern Europe referendum wasn't exactly us on its own. I think the danger in attempting a too radical of an approach is that you alienate other people who are possibly invested in the system, but also believe in democracy itself, and you can get movements that are actually non-democratic or anti-democratic trying to be too radical. But that's just my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, there's so much to the kind of point that you raised, because how do we be effective in a movement, especially today when, you look at the techniques of direct action, a lot of the locking mechanisms, a lot of those were designed by informants, by the FBI. So they're creating this paradigm system and controlling it and manipulating it to the point where it doesn't, you try to be an activist, you try to speak out in a country that's supposedly about democracy, and you're supposedly given these rights, in all of these circumstances, we have to look at, how can we be effective? We have to be transparent. We have to ensure that, when we speak from the heart and we represent our future generations. We have to be invested in it for the long term, that we're not just here because it's a fashion or a fad, that we have to ensure the well-being, what is sacred? What are the things that mean the most to us? Water, our food, all of these things are things that we need and are inherent rights, and it's time for everybody to be here as one, united, and to move forward in a way that, when we build these organizations, they become, fail-proof, because it is upholding the beliefs of democracy. It's upholding our rights, and we have to know those and understand and educate each other and constantly build on that relationship.
All the way in the back.
Morning. My name is Rashad Thomas. My question is, I'm a fashion designer, artist, and I'm constantly in the art community. I also work with a number of organizations that advertise and stuff like that. But I see here in Phoenix that there's a division amongst organizations. Everybody's out for their own mission. And I was wondering, I know this is beautiful and everything, but for someone that like me and my business, it's hard to see how it is possible to help another organization that is only solely wanting to fulfill their mission. So it's not like it's a So I was wondering if you guys all work together, if you ever worked together outside of this forum, and have you ever thought about that to empower your organization and to empower the people that are part of it?
Yes.
You personally, but
Yeah,
I guess.
no, it's not hard finding common ground with other folks, right? And if you look at some of the issues that we dealt with in East Timor, Amnesty International, Key, obviously, other groups that were pro-human rights, were based in Asia and elsewhere. And the thing is broadening your scope and making your struggle appeal to other people. I mentioned we brought various speakers over that spoke about issues. We targeted groups where that was their issue area as well, women's rights, law, international law, etc. So as an organization, that was one of our goals as well, is to build coalitions, because that gets more support for our cause, and we can wield heavier lobbying power with it.
I'd like to also point out that, looking at some of these organizations, it's dealing with border issues. I personally have been involved with, a lot of the struggles for sacred sites, but it also cross-pollinates with other tribes, such as the Tohono O'odham, that are impacted by border militarization. So when we look at these mountains, the Baba Duak, and all these certain sacred places that they can't access because of these borders that are imposed. When, as indigenous people, we see that there are no borders, that we're all brothers and sisters. And that's kind of part of that transition in mindset that we all need to be part of is, okay, obviously you have human rights, you have sacred sites, you have animal rights, so many different levels. Let's start to break them apart and see where they intersect, and the important things that, hopefully we can have, more success stories. It's really inspiring to hear, like the work that's being done in that had been done in East Timor, but we know there are so many other countries as well that are in uprisings. And I personally, as a musician, have been to Mali and know that in Mali, Africa, there's a lot of struggles, and it can be very overwhelming, when you start to look at all the different crises throughout the world. And to be effective, we have to look in our backyard, we have to look in our community and say, okay, what can I do that's going to make a difference here? And maybe that's just buying a product, being educated, and knowing that it's not going to impact somebody half a world away.
Let me add one thing quickly, and that would certainly be that resources are oftentimes limited with all organizations. So one can ill afford to have a shotgun approach. To the extent that it's somewhat more lasered, it can be more effective. Some of our core groups would be the American Civil Liberties Union, because our issues deal with immigration and the law. So we have a very solid relationship with them, in addition to other black-brown coalitions.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the blue.
My question is for Sacred Peace. It's actually a two-part question. The first part of the question is, are studies beginning on the effects of that horrible snowmaking machine up there to document any, especially the animals? I know that was a big concern up there in regards to water. My second part of the question is, what can be done at this point to end what is happening up there in Central Philippines?
So the first question is the studies. This is very important because the Flagstaff Council recently decided to host a forum where they invited the specialists, leading scientists, Catherine Proper, Robin Silver, a lot of discussion on what is the impact now. Okay, the city of Flagstaff, all these organizations tried to prevent these litigations. They kind of passed the buck, as the city of Flagstaff kind of passed the buck along to see, well, we'll let somebody else decide whether it is right or wrong. Okay, now that they're using it, they realize this is their product, and they're most likely going to be liable and responsible. So they, should have started this process, years back, back in 2001 or whatever, this first came up. But now, the city of Flagstaff is kind of panicked because they realize that people are being exposed to this, and they're asking the scientists, like, well, what is the impact going to be? And and the scientists have been telling them all along that, well, first of all, we can't test on humans, and there's no way to really control that kind of environment, but we know what the impacts are on animals, and that it's very serious. And in order to update, the infrastructure, the wastewater treatment plants, this is going to be something that's expensive, and maybe we'll just wait for the EPA for some sort of national policy, some sort of change. And they've been somewhat proactive, mainly because of the liability issue that they're faced with now. And the second part of your question is what can be done, and it is pressuring the city of Flagstaff and writing to the city council. And unfortunately, it's a point where the decision had been made. They are using this equipment. Skiers are exposed to it. People who go up there have been eating the snow and face planting it, and they're starting to realize that wait, maybe we were wrong. This is not necessarily the best choice. And the Forest Service, or the USDA, had held listening sessions, and they created something called an MOU. And this is something that's very important because it doesn't affect just our issue here, even though it's kind of a bit late in the game, but this affects all sacred sites nationally. And the MOUs are part of this listening session that they held, and they created a special kind of policy which crosses, because one of our pushes was for legislation for sacred sites, and unfortunately to go through Congress, at this time, nearly impossible, but through the Obama administration actually implemented the Sacred Sites MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, which they have not implemented yet, and they did not apply it to the San Francisco Peaks, but it enables all tribes, hopefully, to protect their sacred sites and for there to be adequate consultation. And all of that has been done because of our efforts with the San Francisco Peaks. So hopefully, in the long run, this will protect thousands of sacred sites and give the strength and the teeth that most tribes have been looking for in the sacred sites policy.
First of all, I want to thank Brad Conrad for everything he's done for the Glorious Revolution. Second, I want to say Nomad Suerte. You guys are amazing, and I love everything you do. That's for real. No words like y'all over there. That being said, to the prison abolition, or excuse me, the death penalty abolition, you cite race as the reason why you think the death penalty needs to be abolished. As America sits with 1 million black prisoners of our 2.3 million prisoners. You say that we could use the money saved from using the death penalty to hire more cops, but statistics show without fault that cops are far more likely to shoot black people and arrest black people and beat black people than they are anything else. So I really just think that, abolishment of the death penalty is important, but I think all of your facts really state that our justice system is inherently flawed, not just the death penalty, and it's a different route. It's not about stopping the death penalty, it's about stopping this horrible, racist, lock people up factory, especially here in Arizona, where private prisons are, some of our city congressmen and senators are private prison, people. I just think that death penalty is really small scale, and I know for a guy who's about to get killed, it's probably not. But with all the horrendous racist things going on with police nationwide, it's just a weak argument to cite race because the police are racist.
I don't disagree with you at all, but as Ahmad said, we have to be somewhat laser focused, and where I focus is on the death penalty. And I should have taken into consideration my audience. If I'm speaking to Sun City, I want to talk about the money saved, not pursuing capital punishment, can be used for increased police protection. Maybe if I'm speaking here, I say the money saved should be used for education, because the money spent in education, $1 spent in education today will save $7 spent in incarceration 20 years later.
I'm seeing a common thread here when it comes to environmental destruction, when it comes to the killing of indigenous peoples, and it's a name that was up on the board once, but should be mentioned more since they do have local corporate offices, and that would be Freeport-McMoRan.
people here don't really seem to understand how deeply they have their tentacles rooted in so many of these issues. And it is something local, it is something we can affect. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about Freeport, if you don't mind.
I'd love to. Freeport McMoran runs the world's largest open pit gold mine, the second largest open pit copper mine in a territory called West Papua in eastern Indonesia. They pay their own security forces from the Indonesian military and police, right? They're essentially paid militias that do what this multinational corporation asks them to, including murder, disappearances, torture, etc. The police and military are getting more money from Freeport illegally, and in fact, the IWW pursued a complaint citing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and I think it's not in litigation, but I think it's in process. So we've been working with other people here in Arizona, especially folks out of Bisbee, where Freeport has a large presence and where they're seen as sort of this overbearing presence in the city, and where if you go against Freeport, they make your life hell. But sure, tremendous, terrible political and human rights consequences and environmental consequences from Freeport in places like West Papua, and we're seeing it now in Bisbee, et cetera. They're an evil, evil, evil corporation. I can go on for hours, but we don't have hours.
Any other questions? Is everyone hungry? There's going to be a great meal over in the atrium, so thanks for coming. And stay around for the afternoon session.